Imagine designing a fighter jet to destroy an enemy aircraft that hasn't even been built yet. No blueprints to steal, no prototype to study. Just rumors, intelligence reports, and a gut-deep fear that somewhere across the ocean, engineers were building something unbeatable. That's exactly the position the Soviet Union found itself in. And the answer they came up with was strange, radical, and almost completely forgotten by history: the MiG 1.44. This is the story of a jet born to hunt the F-22 Raptor, one of the most feared stealth fighters ever built, and how it flew exactly once before vanishing into obscurity. Stick around, because the ending of this story is far stranger than you'd expect. A quiet war above the clouds. By the late 1970s, the world was fixated on nuclear stockpiles and missile counts. But there was another race happening, quieter, less discussed, and arguably just as dangerous: the race to rule the sky. The Soviets already had a fearsome lineup: the MiG-21, the MiG-23, the MiG-29, the Su-27. Fast, tough, and respected by air forces around the globe. But Soviet planners weren't naive. They could see the writing on the wall. Radar was evolving, missiles were getting smarter, electronics were becoming the deciding factor in aerial combat, not just raw speed and steel. Something was coming. And in 1981, it arrived with a name that sent a chill through Soviet intelligence circles: the Advanced Tactical Fighter Program, ATF for short, the aircraft that started it all. America's goal with the ATF program was audacious: build the successor to the F-15 Eagle. Not an upgrade, a revolution. A fighter that combined stealth, blistering speed without afterburners, next-level electronics, and dogfighting agility, all in one airframe. When word of this reached Moscow, it landed like a gut punch. If the rumors were true, America was building a fighter that could sneak up practically invisible on radar while still outmaneuvering anything in its path. If that jet succeeded, the balance of power in the skies could shift for decades. The Soviet Union couldn't just sit back and watch. They had to answer. And so began one of the most ambitious and ultimately tragic aircraft programs in Soviet history. Enter the MFI program. The response was called the MFI program, the Multifunctional Frontline Fighter. Simple in concept, brutal in execution, build something that could match or beat whatever the Americans were cooking up. Multiple design bureaus threw their hats into the ring during the early research phase. But there could only be one winner, and it went to the legendary Mikoyan Bureau, the same MiG that had built some of the most iconic fighters in Soviet history. Their creation was designated Project 1.42. Its flying prototype would carry a different name, one that would eventually become whispered about in aviation circles for decades: the MiG 1.44. Not an upgrade, a reinvention. This wasn't going to be another tweak to an existing airframe. Soviet engineers were starting from a blank sheet, chasing capabilities that had never before existed in a Russian fighter. The wish list was staggering. Engineers wanted sustained supersonic flight without afterburners, a capability known as supercruise. They wanted dogfighting agility that could outmaneuver anything in the sky. They wanted advanced radar capable of tracking multiple targets simultaneously. And they wanted reduced radar visibility, so the aircraft wouldn't be a sitting duck. That last point was the trickiest. True stealth, the kind America was chasing, was out of reach for now. But Soviet engineers found workarounds: careful shaping of the fuselage, composite materials, and concepts for tucking weapons inside the airframe instead of hanging them off the wings. A design unlike anything else in the sky. What emerged from Mikoyan's drawing boards looked nothing like the F-22. Where the American jet had a conventional, almost sleek wing layout, the MiG 1.44 sported massive delta wings paired with forward canards, a configuration that looked aggressive, unconventional, and slightly alien. That layout wasn't just for show. It delivered enormous lift and razor-sharp agility, especially at steep angles of attack that would send other fighters into a stall. Below the fuselage sat two massive intakes, feeding a pair of powerful engines mounted close together, and crowning it all were twin vertical stabilizers, angled outward, a design choice that added stability while also helping deflect radar waves away from their source. Every curve, every angle on this aircraft told the same story: a careful, sometimes desperate balancing act between raw aerodynamic performance and emerging stealth science. Why the dogfight still mattered. Here's something that might surprise you. Even as missile technology was advancing rapidly, Soviet military doctrine throughout the 1980s still believed close-range dogfighting had a future. That belief shaped the entire soul of the MiG 1.44. While American engineers were betting everything on stealth as the ultimate survival tool, Soviet designers hedged their bets differently, blending speed, raw agility, powerful sensors, and just enough stealth to make a difference. Two completely different philosophies, both racing toward the same finish line. The engines that were supposed to change everything powering this beast were two Lyulko AL-41F engines, not to be confused with the later AL-41F1 engines that would eventually power the Su-57. Each one was designed to pump out roughly 176 kilonewtons of thrust with the afterburner lid, enough grunt to achieve that coveted supercruise capability. But the engines weren't done showing off yet. Designers also planned thrust vectoring nozzles technology that could redirect engine exhaust mid-flight, letting the pilot pull off maneuvers that would be physically impossible in a conventional aircraft. Combine that with the jet's aggressive aerodynamic shape, and you get a fighter that, on paper, could outturn almost anything in the sky. Brains to match the brawn. Inside the cockpit, things were just as futuristic. Instead of old-school mechanical linkages connecting the pilot's controls directly to the flight surfaces, the MiG 1.44 was built around a digital fly-by-wire system, every input processed electronically. This allowed engineers to design an airframe that was intentionally unstable, which boosts agility, while still being safely controllable by the pilot. Gone were the rows of analog dials and gauges. In their place, a glass cockpit, multifunction displays, a wide-angle head-up display, and a sophisticated mission computer designed to reduce pilot workload during high-stress combat scenarios. And then there was the radar and active electronically scanned array, or AESA, system that promised to be a massive leap forward for Russian aviation. Faster target tracking, stronger jamming resistance, the ability to juggle multiple aerial threats at once. There was just one catch: this radar never actually made it onto the flying prototype. Its capabilities remained largely theoretical, a glimpse of ambition that never got tested in the real world. Weapons meant for a war that never came. The MiG 1.44 was designed to carry a wide arsenal, long-range and close-in air-to-air missiles, plus precision-guided munitions for striking ground targets. Engineers even considered internal weapons bays to help shrink the radar signature. But like so much of this aircraft's story, the full weapons package never made it past the concept stage. The prototype that eventually took to the sky carried none of this. Then everything fell apart. By the end of the 1980s, things looked promising. Billions had been poured into the program. Soviet engineers believed they were building something that could genuinely rival, maybe even surpass, whatever America was cooking up. Then, in 1991, the unthinkable happened. The Soviet Union collapsed. Almost overnight, the money that had fueled massive military research programs simply vanished. Defense budgets were gutted. Factories ground to a halt. Aerospace companies that once had guaranteed government contracts suddenly found themselves scrambling just to keep the lights on. For the MiG 1.44, this was catastrophic. Progress crawled to a near standstill. Parts didn't arrive on time. Testing schedules slipped again and again. Suppliers teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. The aircraft that had once symbolized Soviet technological might was now simply fighting to survive at all. But here's the part that makes this story remarkable: the team didn't quit. Against odds that would have crushed most programs entirely, engineers kept assembling that single prototype, piece by piece, convinced that even one successful flight would prove something important, that Russia could still compete at the highest level of fighter design. Nobody knew if that day would ever actually come. 10 years of silence. For nearly a decade, the MiG 1.44 sat hidden behind the walls of Russian testing facilities. Rumors trickled out into the aviation world, whispers of a strange new Russian fighter, something built to rival the best America had. Grainy satellite images, leaked sketches, speculation that spiraled into near-mythical status. But almost nobody had actually seen it, and with each passing year, it seemed less and less likely that anybody ever would. The day it finally flew. Then, on February 29, 2000, nearly 2 decades after the program began, the MiG 1.44 finally lifted off the runway at Zhukovsky Airfield near Moscow. The flight lasted just 18 minutes. At the controls was veteran test pilot Vladimir Gorbanov, tasked with one simple mission: prove this aircraft could safely take off, fly, and land. Nothing flashy, no aggressive maneuvers, just survival. By all accounts, it worked. The jet performed as expected. Its systems held up. After everything, the collapse of a superpower, the years of scraping by, the endless delays, this single aircraft had finally, actually flown. For one brief, hopeful moment, it looked like there might still be a future for this program. The world had already moved on. Here's the gut punch. By the time the MiG 1.44 finally got off the ground, it was already too late. The F-22 had won the ATF competition years earlier. The production F-22 Raptor wasn't just a concept anymore, it was in its final stages of development, on the verge of becoming an operational weapon. America hadn't just finished the race, it had already moved on to the next one. Russia, meanwhile, was still digging itself out of economic ruin. Military budgets were a shadow of what they'd been during the Cold War, and there simply wasn't room financially or politically to fund an all-out push to catch up. So what happened next? Only one prototype was ever completed. It flew a second time a few months after that historic first flight, and then the program quietly stalled. It never advanced to full flight testing. Critical systems, the intended production radar, the complete avionics suite, the full weapons integration never got finished, let alone tested in real combat conditions. Setting the record straight, here's something worth clearing up, because the internet loves to exaggerate this story. You will find plenty of videos claiming the MiG 1.44 was a fully combat-ready aircraft, or that it could have outperformed the F-22 in a straight fight. The historical record doesn't support that. This was a technology demonstrator, a proof of concept. It proved Russia could still design an advanced fighter jet even while its economy was in free fall. But it never reached the point where anyone could properly evaluate its actual combat capability. Full stop. So who would have won? This is the question everyone wants answered. MiG 1.44 versus F-22 Raptor, who takes it? On paper, the MiG 1.44 looks genuinely dangerous. A projected top speed beyond Mach 2, supercruise capability, thrust vectoring paired with that aggressive canard delta layup. In a tight, close-range dogfight, this jet might have ranked among the most agile fighters ever conceived. But modern air combat isn't won by turning circles anymore. The F-22's greatest weapon isn't its speed or its agility, it's the fact that enemy radar barely knows it's there. Every inch of that airframe was engineered around stealth. The fuselage shape, the internal weapons bays, radar-absorbing coatings, precisely aligned panel edges. The MiG 1.44, despite incorporating some stealth thinking, was never expected to come close to that level of invisibility. Those big canards, the exposed engine faces, the overall shape, all of it likely meant a significantly larger radar signature than the Raptors. Then there's the brain of the operation. The F-22 entered service with a sensor fusion system that pulled data from radar, electronic warfare sensors, and more, merging it all into a single, clear picture for the pilot. The MiG 1.44 was designed with similar ambitions, but because the program never moved past the prototype stage, none of that ever got fully built, let alone proven in the air. So really, comparing these two jets head-to-head is almost unfair. One became a fully operational, combat-proven fighter. The other never left the experimental phase. Not a failure, a foundation. Here's the twist most people miss. Even though the MiG 1.44 was cancelled, it wasn't a failure. Far from it. The lessons learned during this program, composite materials, digital flight controls, aggressive aerodynamics, engine integration, low observable shaping didn't disappear. They carried forward into Russia's next major fighter effort. That effort eventually produced the Su-57, Russia's first truly operational fifth-generation fighter. It looks nothing like the MiG 1.44 on the outside, but underneath, historians widely agree, the fingerprints of the MFI program are all over it, the bureau that never recovered. There's a sadder footnote to this story, though. McCoy and the design bureau behind some of the most iconic fighters in history, from the MiG-15 to the MiG-29, never fully recovered its former glory. After the Soviet collapse, Sukhoi steadily took over as Russia's dominant fighter manufacturer. Programs like the Su-30, Su-35, and eventually the Su-57 received the lion's share of government funding and attention, while MiG increasingly found itself upgrading old designs rather than building bold new ones. The question that will never have an answer: what if the Soviet Union had never collapsed? What if the funding had kept flowing, uninterrupted, for another decade? Could the MiG 1.44 have grown into a genuine, battle-ready rival to the F-22? Nobody will ever know for sure. Building a fighter jet isn't as simple as getting a prototype into the air once or twice. It takes thousands of flight hours, constant software refinement, structural redesigns, years of weapons testing. The F-22 itself spent years in testing before it officially entered service in 2005. The MiG 1.44 never got that chance. It got one flight, then a second, and then silence. A legacy written in what ifs. Today, the sole surviving MiG 1.44 prototype sits as a monument to one of the most ambitious aerospace projects Russia ever attempted, a symbol of extraordinary engineering talent, cut down not by technical failure, but by one of the biggest political and economic collapses of the 20th century. It never entered production. It never fired a shot in anger, but it holds a strange, important place in aviation history, a bridge between the fighters of the Cold War and the fifth-generation jets that came after. A reminder that brilliant engineering alone isn't enough. Politics, economics, industrial capacity, and timing decide whether a groundbreaking aircraft becomes a legend or just a fascinating footnote. In the end, the MiG 1.44 never defeated the F-22. That was never really the point. It was the aircraft that dared to answer one of the toughest technological challenges of its era, even knowing the odds were stacked against it. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Sometimes the aircraft that matter most aren't the ones that dominate the skies. They're the ones that quietly clear the path for whatever comes next.